Legal issues and requirements. One of the tough parts about being an entrepreneur, and I empathize with you having been there, is that it is always up to the owner to be aware of legal issues, regulations, licensing, and permits to legally run the business, but it's often difficult to understand and know all the legal issues, regulations, licensing, and permits. And oftentimes, states and federal law might conflict. So there's oftentimes you're wondering, well, this state tells me to do this, federal tells me to do this, and they conflict. How am I supposed to navigate that? So unfortunately, ignorance is never an excuse in business. If you're ever in conflict with one of the rules or regulations for this type of business that you're running, and you're brought up in a court of law, and the judge asks you, why did you do this? And you can't use it as an excuse. I just didn't know. That's not a valid excuse. So you always want to be aware of what the laws are and make sure that you're paying attention to them, or create a strategy argument so that if ever a situation arises where you're asked to explain why you're doing this type of business in the way that you're doing it, you have a good understanding of the knowledge of what the regulation, licensing, and permits are to run your type of business, and also you would have a way to explain why you're doing it this way. And as I said before, it is often difficult to navigate the legal environment because laws are often confusing, unclear, or even contradictory. So to understand how laws are done in the United States, there is laws that are operated and regulated on the federal level. There are some that are done on the state level, and some are conducted on the local level. So businesses are regulated. Why and how? They can be regulated at the federal, state, or even local level, and they can even be regulated on a social level. So this is more of an informal regulation, but it might be that a community doesn't like certain types of businesses in their community. So if you were to go into a neighborhood and launch a certain type of business, the neighbors can get together and picket or protest out in front of your business. So there might be every legal right to run your business. The question might be on a social level or informal level, would you run into some backlash if you were to launch that type of business? So you want to pay attention to what are all these different types of levels that can be regulating your type of business. In addition, they can also be self-regulated by the industry. So different industries might get together and they might set some standards that businesses have to follow in order to be either protected or in order to join a membership or an association. The businesses would have to follow certain regulations. Oftentimes, it is a combination of all of the above. So, how do federal government regulations and laws work? So let's just review how laws are made. Congress would write a bill that would pass both sides of the Congress, the House and the Senate. It would go to the president, and the president would approve the bill. The bill would become an act or statute. The act is codified into U.S. code. So now the bill has become a law, but who enforces it? At this point, the enforcement might be done at the state level. It might be done at the federal level. So there needs to be some enforcement in order for the law to actually have some merit where people would actually pay attention to it and abide by that law. So it has to be enforced as well. To enforce a law requires regulation. A regulation specifies what is legal and what isn't. It will also outline who enforces the law and the penalties for not following the law. Is it confusing? You sure bet it is. The law may be federally or state enforced. How do you find out? So industry regulations for your business, especially someone new to an industry, it's good to start with an industry association search. For example, blank industry association. So this is going to be useful for you in many, many purposes, many, many modules for this business program. So I always suggest you find a local industry association based on the type of business you are. So for example, if you're in the coffee industry, you might type into Google search engine, Coffee Industry Association. And these are typically nonprofit organizations that operate collaboratively with all the coffee retailers, all the suppliers, maybe even the state, and maybe even customers, in order to provide some resources to the members. And so you typically want to look and see, because there's, as I search here, there might be more than one. Okay, you'll want to look at what are the benefits of them. And so you might say market research, business directory. There's typically something about in the industry associations. Let's see what it is. Nope, that's not what we want. We want to look through, and what we're looking for is regulations. Oftentimes it might be specific in there, but you're seeing certain things like coffee and Prop 65. Oftentimes the business industry association will get together and they'll lobby the government in order to understand what the rules and regulations are. So they're actually helping the government create industry regulations. So I'm looking at, oftentimes I want to see what is the law, but also there's usually webinars or some type of information about how to start a business. And there's often workshops that say these are all the rules and regulations you need to follow. So take a look at this, and no matter what industry you're in, you typically can find a business industry association that will be very helpful for you. So remember, individuals, including me, the instructor, can't give you legal advice on how best to start your business up. So only a business attorney has the legal authority to offer entrepreneurs legal advice. So if you want to ask the question, what are all the rules and regulations I need to follow in order to run my business, we can point you in the right direction and say, this is typically what happens. We can point you to an industry association. We can point you to a website that might have a list. But we can't tell you these are the ones you have to follow. Because of that often contradictory information, and the rules and regulations and laws might conflict with each other, oftentimes we need to create a strategy in order to understand how best to proceed. So if you're ever getting stuck, we do recommend meeting with a business attorney, and they can give you advice on how best to strategize on how to move forward. But remember, it's not always 100% clear on what you should do. It's your best effort in moving forward in the industry in order to do your best job to follow those rules and regulations. So one of the legal issues is intellectual property. When setting up your business, it's important to not only think about the physical space as property, but also the intellectual property that will be established. So for example, it's not only the building that you might rent to run your coffee shop, but it's also the name that would go on the sign. So this not just the sign, but the name itself. That's part of the intellectual property. You can own that name for your coffee shop. So how does that flow into the checklist of things that you have to do in order to set up your business? Okay, we will discuss that more in a future module, but I think it's very important to consider that some of the things we're talking about is not the actual things you do, especially if you're creating a virtual space, if you're selling things online. There's many things that you have to follow that are not just in the realm of the physical world. Another thing you want to consider are legal contracts. So these are the process or the interaction that your business interacts with customers. Anytime you have a transaction, it becomes a contract, and it's formed between the two entities to trade goods and services. So laws will often dictate what is legal and how they are enforced. The contract doesn't have to be a written document to be enforced. So oftentimes the government will become involved and they will say this is how a business has to interact with customers. So the way that contracts are developed and the interaction between business and customers is often heavily regulated. Torts. What are those? A tort is a private offense between two parties that is often remedied by monetary compensation. Often the judgment for compensation depends on the contract between the two parties. What if there is no contract? How can a judge decide who is right in a tort? So this is where it would be very helpful to have a contract written by an attorney, or you can go to a business industry association, and they might provide your type of business with a standard contract that you can use. If a judge or tort ever became an issue and a judge was looking at the contract, one that was professionally written with the experience of either an attorney or an attorney working on behalf of an industry association, oftentimes would be more professional, and a judge might be siding with that type of contract because it had the experience of a professional attorney writing it. Next up is setting up the business location.